Can you explain to us what would have been different if a major incident had been declared earlier? Why is that so important?
I think it's really important in terms of sort of mobilising police resources and making sure that this wasn't seen as sadly so often is, another example of someone not being in the right place at the right time and not being treated as high risk. So if, for example, a major incident had been declared, I think that the force would have been much sharper around making sure that members of the public couldn't trample all over the site of the bench where Nicola's phone had been found, for example, and they would have been able to draw in resources, perhaps national resources as well, more rapidly. But, you know, from my perspective, I think the thing about this report, which really vindicates what a lot of female commentators were saying at the time, was really the outrage that people felt that, you know, a number of weeks into Nicola going missing, for whatever inextricable reason, Lancashire Police thought it was the right thing to do to put out information relating to Nicola, which was highly sensitive, highly personal, and not the type of information you would ever expect a force to put out in respect of a man. So I think the misogyny and the sexism that was displayed in that act on the part of Lancashire, perhaps unwittingly, has been called out rightly in this report.
Yeah. I mean, perhaps unwittingly is the key phrase here, isn't it? Because it's actually still quite hard after reading the report to understand what happened there, because the family had asked for a reference to her struggles with menopause to be removed from a press release, but it wasn't. So it's not as if it slipped through entirely. Somebody had flagged that up.
It was really difficult to fathom and understand. And I remember listening to it on the radio. I remember exactly where I was when this came out over the news bulletins. And it really did literally stop me in my tracks, because I thought, what on earth has that got to do with finding Nicola, and bringing her back home safely? How on earth would we feel if we started talking about struggles that men were having with alcohol in respect of them going missing? So you're quite right. The actual, you know, the report says it was unnecessary and avoidable that information shouldn't have been put in the public domain. But I'm not sure it's got to the heart of, well, exactly why did you do that? It kind of breached all kind of rules of decency, actually. And to hear that the family specifically didn't want that information in the public domain just makes it even more worrying. But I suppose on a more positive note, the forces, of course, commended for a number of the technical bits of the investigation they undertook. And also, I think all police forces in the country will now be looking at their own processes to make sure that this sort of thing can never happen. And it's important, isn't it, that it does? Because if our loved ones go missing, and they may have some form of vulnerability, I don't want people to be thinking, well, I'm not going to call the police in case this information about them gets put in the public domain. That will have a real chilling effect on people stepping forwards.
Very much so. So briefly, if you can, because we really don't have very much time, I noticed something called nonreportable briefings between the press and the police was mentioned in the report as something that was missing in this investigation. Now, what exactly does that mean, and why weren't those happening?
Well, I think this goes back to, the time when the police did have a closer relationship with the press, so they could do off-the-record briefings, basically. And I spoke to journalists around the time of Nicola Bulley, and they said to me, 5 or 10 years ago, they would have been brought into a room, they would have been given background information that was sensitive information that would have answered a number of their questions on the promise that they don't put it into the public domain. And I think that there's cause for common sense to prevail in investigations like this, for forces to trust journalists not to use information that could be damaging either to the victim or their family, but actually allows them to then report in a sensitive way. And I think it's good that this report really requires us to go back to have a look at whether we can make that happen in the future.
Just really briefly, Zoe, I mean, this case, it was absolutely out of control on social media, wasn't it? So responsible journalists, trained journalists behaved in one way, and out there in social media land, anything went. It was just ridiculous.
It was incredible. I mean, people were coming down and putting on TikTok their own investigations of what happened around the bench and, you know, reporting all sorts of outlandish kind of conspiracy theories. And, you know, the police didn't help themselves by bringing in someone who, you know, proclaimed something to be, you know, kind of clear of evidence when clearly it wasn't. So I think the police did have a real difficult job on this. I remember commentating at the time, and, you know, there was interest all over the world in this particular case because of the very unique circumstances. So I'm not saying it wasn't easy for the police to contain, but the bottom line on this, it should never have been the police press office that put that information in the public domain.